Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I am your host this week, Brian Watson, and today I think we have a very interesting episode. I was recently at the American Historical Association and the Modern Language Association conventions, which both happened in Chicago this year. And while I was there, I took the time to interview several historians about their researching, who they were, their background, kind of like a short, compressed version of the topics we normally do every week. So this episode will be a little bit different. We will be featuring 4 different historians, and that's casting that broadly because we are also including in this and a second episode to follow people who wouldn't necessarily first identify themselves as historians, but were at the convention and do a lot of work, and I think also count as historians. As Eric Zillow, one of our interviewees, mentioned, we should cast that net broadly. The one thing I would say that is different also from our usual episodes is that because these were recorded at a convention, which was rather noisy, there is some background noise, there's some people walking in and out, but I've managed to correct most of that out, so I don't think it will be too distracting, and I hope it is not. So without further ado, here are the bios of our individual interviewees today. Our first interviewee is Corey Bowen, who is actually on AskHistorians as Commodorecoco. He is a PhD student at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He works at the Field Museum as well. His research interests are landscape archaeology, ethnogenesis, social dynamics of architecture, specifically in the Andes region, and he's also interested in identities in the early middle horizon history of archaeology and public archaeology. Second interview, which will follow Corey, is Eric Zillow, and if you are on Twitter at all and active within historian circles, you very well know this name. He is the chair of the Department of History and Philosophy and associate professor of European history. He specializes in modern Britain and Ireland with a particular emphasis on the histories of tourism and national identity. He's published quite a few books. Particularly interesting is The History of Modern Tourism in 2015, Making Ireland Irish, Tourism and National Identity Since the Irish Civil War, which is in 2009. He's also the editor of Touring Beyond the Nation, a transnational post to European tourism history, and the co-editor of Tourism Histories in Ulster and Scotland, all of which are very fantastic works, and you should definitely take a read. After Eric, we will have an interview with Elizabeth Man Lapis, who is a high school history teacher. On her bio, she says she travels with students, she makes podcasts, and she wants to make cool things with other creative people. She works as a consultant talking with people about history, teenagers, and teaching. She talks with writers about what high school is like in the 21st century, how dual enrollment works, and how a kid might get away with hiding a secret identity. She has a master's degree in history from Georgia State University and a bachelor degree in history from Mercer University. And finally, we will be interviewing Jason W. Herbert, who is a historian interested in the relationship between southeastern American Indians, Europeans, and Africans in the 18th and early 19th century. His dissertation examines the social, political, demographic, and ecological transformation of Florida following the introduction of livestock in the 16th century through the expulsion of much of the region's native inhabitants in the 19th century. In addition, he is the creator of Historians of the Movies, where you might know him. He called it a multimedia experience that connects historians and others each week via their favorite films, and you can find him on Twitter at Herbert History. And the hashtag, if you are looking to follow Historians at the Movie, is hashtag HATM every Sunday, I believe, and he'll talk about that a little bit more. So we will first have Corey, and then Eric, and then Amy, and then Jason. I hope you enjoy this, and as always, please come by and support us on Patreon. That's at patreon.com/AskHistorians, and please subscribe and rate all of our podcasts, which we're over 100, almost 150 episodes on various in-depth topics about history. So I hope you subscribe and enjoy this.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Well, how about you start with telling us what your name is, where you're from, what you're studying?
I'm Corey Bowen. I am from Michigan originally. I'm currently in Chicago. I'm studying archaeology at the University of Illinois at Chicago / the Field Museum with focus on Indian archaeology and mostly how people engage with and understand their pasts and how those pasts are constructed through political and cultural processes.
What do you mean when you say Indian archaeology? Do you mean India or do you mean Native American?
Indian. So
what specifically? Is it like South America or North America?
Yeah, So I work in the Andes Mountains of South America. I started working in northern Peru, but have since moved to the highlands of Bolivia.
Why that area?
There's a lot of young scholars working in the Andes. I had considered for a little bit working down over in Europe, in Greece and Rome, but it's packed. People have been doing that for 250 years. There's not really a space to find your way in. So most of the scholars in the Andes are young. They're doing exciting things. There's not as much of the kind of problematic backings that you see in archaeology in some other places, because archaeology there is a very modern, recent thing. So it comes in with an already relatively critical understanding of the peoples it's studying, the way it interacts and engages with the communities there. And so there's a lot less of this problematic past that you see, especially in North American archaeology and Egyptian archaeology.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what do you mean by problematical past?
So for instance, working at the Field Museum, you go down to the collections there, and there's all kinds of things there that we have no idea where they're from because someone just went to somewhere in the world, took them, brought them back. Now they're just there, and we can only know so much about them. And that's something that's particularly problematic a lot, especially for a lot of the southwestern collections. So we kind of know when they got there, who bought them. This guy named Alfred Kroeber, who acquired a lot of them from the Southwest, but he actually just bought them and brought them to the museum. And something that you see in Peru and Bolivia is that through a lot of these nationalist movements in the middle of the 20th century, there's a lot of strict laws placed on the movement of artifacts, prevented a lot of that from happening. You go back 100 years ago, and a lot of that did happen. So the Field Museum actually has a bunch of collections that are from that era that are unprovenanced and are very problematic themselves. But because a lot of the archaeology there has grown out of this very nationalistic tradition, which of course is its own problem, the whole question of nationalism, but that has empowered local communities to be involved and engaged with the archaeological practices, and it means that even though there's a lot of foreign scholars there, we don't dominate the field as much. And we come in with a theoretical backing that reflects what we call in archaeology the post-processual movement, kind of a manifestation of postmodernism in archaeology that goes away with a lot of these ideas of kind of scientific objectivity that was super problematic in the 50s and 60s in American archaeology and Mesoamerican archaeology.
So I have a question. I have a question to follow up on that. But can you just talk for a second why it's so important to archaeologists to have the record of like where they come from? Why can't we just like examine like these trinkets that somebody brought back from Rome or something?
So objects on their own can tell us a lot, especially if there's writing on them, if there's a lot of art on them. Obviously, that's not the case for most things. If you have a bunch of Tupperware in your kitchen, that's not going to be really helpful if someone else finds that. Okay, it's shaped like a sandwich. Maybe they ate sandwiches. But let's say you find that Tupperware in an excavation where you're excavating a kitchen, and you can find where it was placed, and you can find what was in it. That's what we call context. It's spatial relation to the matrix that it's in, the soil and other things around it. It's spatial relation to the architecture around which it is found, and a spatial relation to other artifacts. So obviously, if we find just a plain bowl in a grave versus a trash midden versus in a kitchen, those three all indicate very different uses for that bowl. And without having that provenience, that's a lot of information that we lose.
What do you so I know a lot of archaeologists like are very upset when they see stuff like on eBay or like on random internet sites where you can buy stuff. Like, is that because you lose all that context, or because it's looted, or?
It's a combination of a lot of things. So first of all, of course, is that loss of information with the context. The problem with something like eBay, and this is something I actually teach a lot about in our introduction to archaeology classes, is the idea of placing a monetary value on these objects from the past. That's just a practice that we just generally do not support in any way. Even if that money is, say, going back to the communities, or even if that money is used to support for their research, the idea that these are objects for sale is incredibly problematic. These are cultural heritage items. These are important to somebody somewhere, and treating them as things to be treating them as commodities, not in their original senses, because they probably at some point were commodities, but objects of value that's just purely monetary twists the public conception of what archaeology can be.
So I'd like to follow up on what you said earlier about postmodernism. How does postmodernism, like when I think postmodernism, I think of like T.S. Eliot or like the literature, like how sporadic literature or very strange plays on stage. How does postmodernism really even get into archaeology in the first place?
It's archaeology, and we like dirt, and we like material, and we like actual real things. So the extent to which postmodernism has ever affected archaeology is limited. We, as I mentioned, we use the term post-processual as this kind of movement that starts in the 80s in response to something that happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s that's called, of course, processualism. That was a movement towards very strict, very standardized, very modernist scientific thinking in archaeology that saw the introduction of systems theories and a lot of models and a lot of mathematic formulas.
Can you explain what you mean by system theories? They're like kind of saying like, oh, if we know these things, we can map how cultures develop.
Yeah, exactly. So rather than taking the data that you have and building interpretations out of that, trying to fit them into broader theories, broader models, that eventually, after people were doing this for 20 years, people started realizing that there was no real theoretical backing for what they were doing. It was just kind of assumed. It was inherent. This is the way cultures exist. This is the way cultures evolve. This is the way cultures change.
Oh, okay.
So
Jared Diamond.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And in some ways worse, because at least Jared Diamond is taking there's some evidence and some facts that he's building that theory off of. A lot of the 50s, 60s, 70s anthropology was based in this kind of neo-evolutionary model that harkens back to 100 years ago to 1850s, 1860s with these very early like classifications of human developmental stages. You have, instead of Lewis Henry Morgan's like barbarism and savagery and civilization, all of a sudden you have now chiefdoms and bands and tribes. And there's a great book by Tim Paukertat, who worked at Cahokia, that talks all about how chiefdoms basically just don't exist. It's like, what do we mean when we talk about a chiefdom? And that was one of those terms that was kind of taken as a scientific category. We are going to assume that chiefdom is kind of some inherent substantive term under which societies organize themselves, and it's somewhere along a developmental scale of complexity that exists but after a band, but before the state. And
it's a tech tree.
Yeah, it's a tech tree. It is. It's a tech tree in fancy clothes. They dress it up in systems theory and environmental determinism. Not quite determinism. Not quite that. But adaptations. And that whole class of theory, eventually they realized, hey, this isn't really based on something. These are very assumed. These are implied. And so where postmodernism comes in is it's questioning the implicit assumptions there. And questioning the need for a single archaeological narrative and finding the value in multiple archaeological narratives. So you get indigenous archaeologies that appear, you get feminist archaeologies that appear. You start trying to find children and women in the archaeological record. You start trying to find all those fancy terms like power, all those terms like identity.
And so where does postmodernism move that discussion beyond?
And so that's...
I guess to kind of bring it back to like what you're studying specifically.
Exactly.
How can you change? How do you guys change that?
And so what I'm looking at now is it's kind of, I don't want to say a postmodern era, but
we need new terms.
Yeah, we need new terms. Things that aren't continually referencing themselves. There's someone who likes the term new processualism instead of post-processualism, which sure, I'll take it. But recognizing. There's a term actually that comes up a lot, and this isn't quite what's going on, but you get it kind of as an early form of the post-processualism of behavioral archaeology. Rather than looking at what societies are doing, what are people doing? And portraying peoples as actors rather than kind of subjects to these broader cultural systems that are those systems are the things that are happening and doing things rather than the people that are happening and doing things. So that's what I look like looking at. And rather than having this is the history, but this is this is the way people talk about history. Because the way people talk about history and the way people use history and the way people make decisions based on the history that they know or assume to be true is a lot more interesting than what actually happened. And so that's something that we can look in the archaeological record and see big empires like the one I'm studying, the Tiwanaku Empire, to kind of promote their own power, to promote their own hegemony. How are they engaging with their own past? And how are they continuing or altering or deleting the pasts of the people that they encompass in their own empire? And today, how are people looking back at that Tiwanaku Empire and incorporating it into modern identities today? Yeah. And how do they recognize that as, is it history? Is it not? Is it part of us? So the question I get asked all the time there is, are you going to find the Aymara? And so the Aymara are one of the dominant indigenous groups in the Bolivian Altiplano and the highlands. And since the election of Evo Morales, who identifies as Aymara, there's been this kind of resurgence of Aymara nationalism, equating Bolivian national identity with Aymara identity. And that's conversely propagated Aymara identity into the past, where everything that's archaeological in Bolivia becomes Aymara. And so even if there's no solid evidence, and even if there's plenty of evidence against something having any connection to the Aymara people, it becomes an Aymara site, and therefore political, and therefore Bolivian national identity. And so the strongest, most obvious example of this, and there's been a lot of study on this, is every winter down there, summer for us, there's the solstice ceremony, and the president of Bolivia flies down in his helicopter to the main temple at the Tiwanaku site that's 1,500 years old, and walks out and does this llama sacrifice offering there. And it's this weird convergence of Bolivian nationalism and indigenous Aymara heritage, and also this very constructed touristic kind of thing, because this isn't necessarily a ceremony that ever happened at Tiwanaku. This isn't necessarily a ceremony that ever happened 500 years ago during the Aymara Señores. So it's this idea of these multiple histories, and who is using this history, who's portraying this history, who's presenting this history, and how all of these different histories can exist at once and kind of rely on each other, even as they adamantly claim that each one is the proper one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so to try to draw us toward the conclusion, you are active on AskHistorians, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about AskHistorians and what you find is important about it, and why you continue to be involved in AskHistorians?
Yeah. So the one thing that I realize, talking about how people view the past, is that people don't really view South America at all. And that's something that's come up. Of course, working in the sub is the number of questions about South America whatsoever is very limited. But when they do come up, there's a lot of misconceptions that have to be addressed. And that's something that is very, very important. As an educator myself, as a future professor, as things like that, that we need to be engaged with the public if we want to teach the public. And the format of AskHistorians, being public directed, gives us an opportunity to see what knowledge people are coming in with, and generally what lack of knowledge people are coming in with, which is something that's super, super important if we want to address those misconceptions. So something that happens a lot, especially in introductory level courses, is you set out, this is what we want to teach people, this is what people want to know. But that's so hard to do if you don't know what people don't know, and you don't know what misconceptions and problems and ideas that people are already coming in with, and how to address and engage with those. So I think AskHistorians is an incredible opportunity to understand those misconceptions, understand where people are coming from, and understand what people actually want to know. So this is something that obviously we've seen lots before in previous years, but in the past couple of weeks I've actually seen a lot of is the typical question of, if Native Americans got European diseases, why didn't Europeans get Native American diseases? Which that comes up all the time, and it's usually, I calculate it out as 1.5 times per week was the average for 2017. But I think it's been 2 or 3 times per week in the past 2 or 3 months. And that's a question that I haven't seen addressed in the 100-level class that I've taught or been involved with. But it's obviously a question that anthropologists and historians are positioned to answer, but that answer just isn't out there. There's a lot of popular narratives, obviously dealing with the impact of European disease on Native Americans, but people see problems with that, and they're right to see problems with that. Yeah. But there's no place that historians are providing them answers to that. That's a lack of knowledge that people have that really needs to be addressed, and Ask Historians is a place for that lack to be exposed.
And even it lets you know what you can teach or what you should be teaching, or maybe like how you can focus on it and like change people's minds.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you a lot for joining us today, Corey, and I hope to see you around Ask Historians.
So, what do you want to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. How about you start with just telling us who you are, what you research, and where you're based right now?
Yeah, so my name is Eric Zillow. I'm the chair of the Department of History and Philosophy at the University of New England, which is in Biddeford, Maine. It's a small college, fairly small department, but we're able to do some kind of cool stuff. I'm a historian of Britain and Ireland, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, and then more specifically still a historian of tourism. And so that's where I've done a lot of my work. My first book was on how tourism in Ireland after the Irish Civil War allowed for the creation and perpetual recreation of an Irish national identity. That led me to, well, as I was doing that project, it was nominally about Ireland and really about national identity in my mind. But I started realizing, the more I was in the archives, that the Irish story was connected with everything else. It was connected with what was happening in the United States, what was happening in France. There were, during the interwar years, Irish tourism officials went to Germany to study Krafft-Freude, which was the Nazi leisure organization. They were picking and choosing, well, they were getting ideas from all over the place. And so that led to an edited collection called Touring Beyond the Nation about the need to write tourism history in a transnational way. And as I was doing that, I started thinking, well, gosh, there's no history of global tourism. And so my second book was that. It was a history of how tourism evolved, really from the 18th century, but in the first chapter I go back to Lucy. And in doing that, I started realizing just how little there is on empire tourism. So I'm working on a project now about really tourism within the British Empire. It's early days for that, but I'm kind of excited about where it might go.
I mean, that's always early days for the next book project, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I've got I've got another project that it's currently
incipient.
Well, I've actually done a lot of work on it. It's just I haven't had time to. It's not that I haven't had time to finish it. It's that as I was working on it, it's about pubs and sociability and nostalgia in Britain after World War II.
That's one of my favorite topics.
It's fabulous. And really interesting, but as I was working on it, I started realizing there were other things that I felt I needed to look at first so that I could fully understand what I was seeing. And so empire tourism is actually part of that, because I think decolonization is part of the story, and I learned about that. So.
I read your first book. Actually, I have the second one on my bookshelf to read. I swear I will read it this year.
That's exciting. But it's a quick read.
I'm excited for it. I was interested when I was reading that one how it plays into narratives about like the Grand Tour, because I know Ireland. I think in your book you kind of presented you can look at this as like a way of globalization, a way like things are coming together. Or at least that was sort of my reading on it.
Well, in terms of the Grand Tour, I mean, the Grand Tour establishes some approaches to travel and some ways of thinking about it that in the 19th century then become much broader. Certainly, early tourists to Ireland were doing a lot of the same things and interested in some of the same things that Grand Tourists were. Grand Tour was really very urban, so when people were coming to Ireland, it wasn't so much about the urban, it was about the rural and the sublime and beautiful and so on. So there was another 18th century trend that was kind of leading to that. But the idea of traveling to improve oneself. For a grand tourist, it was about establishing one's status in society as a leader of society. And so maybe Irish tourism wasn't quite that, but there's still this idea that if you travel, you are in fact making yourself a better person. You're gaining more perspective.
So when you spend that globally, does that does like improving yourself when you're traveling? Is that when you're talking about global empires with your latest research?
Yeah, well, so kind of working it out, right? So at the moment, I'm really interested in how, and it's very much like making Ireland Irish, very much, or I'm interested in how the act of traveling in India led to interactions between hosts and guests, which is a kind of common trope in tourism history and tourism studies more generally, that shaped the identities in both places.
Yeah.
So certainly English tourists, and this was true in Ireland, when they went to Ireland or when they go to India, they are getting a better sense of who they think they are, defining themselves relative to the other. But and that's not something that's been ignored by scholars. But what strikes me as interesting is that that's reciprocal. So the Irish looking at what others might see when they were seeing them was really important as they were creating post-Civil War Irish tourism. How did they want to be perceived? What was it? What did it mean to be Irish to them? And that meant lots of different things. So it's not like it's a one to one kind of discussion. It's all kinds of voices. Well, India is even more complicated. The colonial relationship's more complicated. Well, it's a colonial relationship in Ireland. Well, not after the Civil War theory, but post-colonial anyway. But it isn't as because the colonized sort of lose their voice. They're not necessarily thought of very much. So, I'm interested in are there ways to recover that? And I think there are. Early on in the early part of the story in the early 19th century, there's company paintings, which is a sort of genre of painting. Some of that is what the artist thinks the English buyer wants, and probably some of it is what they think as well. So there's a kind of a complicated thing there. Later in the century, and this is what I'm finding, what I'm writing about at the moment, later in the century they pick up the form of the guidebook. The scholarship on this is all about guidebooks as an exercise, or travel writing as an exercise of power by the colonizer. And it is that. It's not necessarily trying to be that, but what happened in India by the late 19th century, the story of early Indian nationalism is essentially Indian elites who are trying to kind of create a unified sense of what India is. And they pick up the guidebook form. You read these guidebooks, they're not all that different than what was happening in Europe. Actually, if you read guidebooks to India, they're not that much different either. The form is pretty consistent. But they pick up that form. Now, they emphasize some things that it might be a little bit different. They talk about Hinduism in a very different way than, of course, an English guidebook would. There's a lot more assumed knowledge and things like that. Much less racism. But,
that's my assumption.
But the basic form is the same, right? And I think that's really interesting. You get guidebooks that even are discussing what the national politicians are doing and so on, which is kind of striking. And so I'm kind of working through that stuff. And
I was kind of thinking when you were saying that, like, one is like for the person visiting, and I'm from New England, and I'm sure you're familiar with leaf peeping season, where people from New York come up and they have this assumption of what rural New England life is like. And sometimes we're in vacation towns like that. It's like a lot of like, oh God, here they are again. I think in some extent we do find ourselves playing to that role in some ways. Creating that, like Keene, New Hampshire, the perfect example, is all brick, all like leaves and pumpkins everywhere. So it's like curating that for both for local profit and for local identity, I think.
No, that's right. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion amongst anthropologists who picked up tourism as a topic a little bit earlier, probably because anthropologists have to be concerned with what happens when an outsider comes into a community. They can't not, it's what they do. And so they've been really concerned about it. So there's been a debate about, so does tourism fundamentally transform the host because they start acting a role? And then they can't not act that role. It just becomes who they are. And I of course, I argue that that's not true. I think it's much more complicated than that. People have agency. They can decide.
What a shocker.
But, we do nevertheless try to please. Even if we're not people pleasers, we are people pleasers. And so that's, I think that's an important part of the dynamic.
So I guess kind of two related questions to kind of bring us towards a conclusion. It's like, how did you first get into this, and to kind of bring us to that end conclusion, what should people get out of tourism today?
Well, I got into it. I went into graduate school wanting to study national identity. There was Rudy Koshar was a faculty member there, and he was starting to work on a tourism project that ultimately became a book on German travel guidebooks, and it's called German Travel Cultures. And I was taking a lot of seminars with him because we had sort of overlapping interests. He was really interested in ideas, and I found that really attractive. And he wrote an article that I read along the way, and it was about how national identities are perpetuated and so on through guidebooks, how they're representative of identity. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. Mm-hmm. I can do something interesting with this. And so that's how I got into it. And I'm really interested in connections and what happens when we interact with other people, mm-hmm. what happens when different cultures and groups come together. So tourism's been a really interesting way to do that. Yeah. And as far as what we should get out of it, so we've launched a new book series with Cornell called Histories and Cultures of Tourism. And part of the idea behind that is that by using tourism as a lens, the way I did with national identity, you can get at all kinds of things you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Wow.
The most interesting kind of tourism scholarship, I think, tourism history scholarship, is revealing just how connected tourism is to the larger world, to basically any of the stories we think about in terms of modernity. Now, arguably it goes back further, and I'd certainly be keen on manuscripts, proposals that look at earlier time periods. But in the modern period, tourism intersects with politics, it intersects with identity, it intersects with aesthetics, it intersects heavily with environmental history. Yeah. It intersects with mobility in general, with transportation history, with technology. In some cases, you wouldn't expect that.
Yeah.
You absolutely wouldn't. I would not have thought before reading one of the kind of seminal texts, it was published in 2000 by Shelley Baranowski, Strength Through Joy, I would not have thought that if you want to understand National Socialism, you should probably understand their leisure policy, because it was important. And you read that book and you go, yeah, well, that makes sense.
I was thinking Jeremy Black's book, Travel, Grand Tour, and he talked, just the way he talked about like how miserable travel was in the 17th century, and how they were like stay over in barn with no heat, and just that concept, because I was so used, I did my own Grand Tour and I was staying in hostels in various places, and just like that concept really alters like the way you look at these propertied English gentlemen wandering through these mud pits in Italy.
Well, some of those stories are fantastic. They're really great stories. Of course we pick up that trope now as tourists. We all like to complain about the horrible experiences we've had as much as we like to talk about the exciting ones, which is really interesting. I mean, a lot of the tropes, the idea that tourists are somehow lesser than travelers starts with the Grand Tour. Yeah. We're mindlessly following some kind of beaten track, and we're doing so in an unthinking way.
Yeah.
Is that fair? Probably not, but it's certainly an established narrative, just like the idea that travel is suffering. Now, for a grand tourist, it was a lot harder than it is for us. But boy, we like to pat ourselves on the back.
We really do. I guess my final question for you is, anybody that knows you knows how active you are on Twitter, how active you are like promoting public history. Like, why? What's the drive there?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, so the Twitter thing was a result of thinking about my own teaching and thinking about what I thought others might want as much as I did. I mean, when you're teaching every day, especially with a high teaching load, you end up not necessarily paying attention to what's happening in terms of history in the news, for example. And yet, anybody who's been in a classroom knows that you can connect really well with students if you walk in and you can talk about something ripped from the headlines.
Yeah.
It makes the past very immediate. And of course, the past is the present, so that's very logical, but for a student, they don't necessarily think that way. And so you can make it very present for them and very relevant. And I started thinking, well, all right, so I don't necessarily follow history in the news as much as I want to. I bet others are in the same boat. Mm-hmm. So why don't I do a Twitter feed that's kind of a clearinghouse, if you will, for what's in the news that day that has a obvious history connection, whether that's some great new archaeological find at Pompeii or the way historians are analyzing the Trump administration, whatever it happens to be. I bet people would like that.
Yeah.
And so that's really what the Twitter feed was. Now, along the way, I can kind of put a plug in for the book series or put a plug in for Journal of Tourism History. But even that's about raising awareness of really cool stuff, because Journal of Tourism History publishes some amazing stuff and people should know about it. And there's so much out there in scholarly journals and so on, it's hard to keep track of. So
I think what you're doing is really important, because just for other historians to follow, but it's just important for even people who aren't historians. And I see a lot of people comment on this who aren't really necessarily historians, but they're following it as a habit, and I think that helps them think like historians and become more involved in the culture.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, so much of K-12 history education, and it isn't really the fault of educators, but so much of it is about names, dates, important bits of legislation. And we often, I think, I think I was like this. You come out of high school and you sort of think that that's what history is. It's the past. When I ask students on the first day of class, what is history? They'll say it's everything that happened in the past. When you sit down and watch a news broadcast, this drives me nuts. We're watching history being made. No, you're not. No, you're not. You're watching events
you don't have the analysis that comes with.
You're watching events that may be important. Yeah. But the history being made is the historian sitting in the archive or the historian sitting at their computer writing it. Now, historian is I think we can be fairly broad about it. We in academia like to say, we're in the those of us who are in colleges and universities are the historians. But we engage with the past and process it in many different ways, whether that's historical fiction or whether that's popular history, which is more narrative, or whether it's historical analysis on CNN. And appreciating that, I think, really matters. So, making this stuff available, and it's obviously already available, but making people aware of it and giving people a nice spot they can go to is certainly useful. And I hope that they do think about it more critically the way you're suggesting.
Yeah, well, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you for doing this, but thank you for everything you do online.
Oh, thanks a lot. This was good fun.
And where should people find you if they need to find you?
So I have a website, ericzilo.com, or what's the Twitter handle, @ezilo.
Yes.
EZUELOW, capital E, capital Z. Mm-hmm. Yes, and just you search my name, you'll find me. It's
great.
Not hard to find.
So why don't you start us out by telling us who you are and what you do and what brings you here?
Okay, well, my name is Amy Elizabeth Man Lapis. I am a high school history teacher in Atlanta, Georgia, and I've wanted to be a historian since I was 15, and I took my first world history class. My focus is mainly in teaching world history, and I'm particularly interested in studying how we tell stories about ourselves as a people. So, for example, going through and looking at how the United States at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century talked about itself as an empire, about how Japan changed its identity with the Meiji reforms. That kind of thing is what I'm really interested in. And I also really like the idea of teaching people really practical skills of sort of reading against the grain of a text and learning to think about continuities and changes over time, similarity and difference, because not everyone wants to wake up in the morning and be like, fuck yeah, the Ottomans. Oh, can I say fuck?
Yeah, you can say fuck.
yeah, I wake up in the morning and I'm like, fuck yeah, the Ottomans, but not everyone feels that way, I get really emotional about like Paleolithic cave art. So I have a lot of interests and passions, but the main one is getting people to think about where they come from and where are we going and how does that relate to
what does everything even mean anymore?
Exactly. And I love those really murky gray area questions. questions.
So I guess I have two kind of questions after that. The first one is like, why world history? Like, one about world history versus like kind of like one specific topic.
Right. Well, the thing that I love about world history that makes it so unique is that it asks people to make comparisons and to ask yourself, how are these areas similar? How are they different? If there aren't any differences present, why? Why is this something that seems to be universal when there are differences? What is the significance of that? Because ultimately, we are one people, we are one planet, and I really love thinking of everyone as a whole. And that really, really appeals to me. Sort of to get that big picture.
And I guess, how is it like teaching high schoolers now, especially like in the age of where politics is in such upheaval and like world history is in such change?
I mean, honestly, I love teaching high school. Up until a few years ago, it was pretty okay, especially teaching in public school, because there weren't too many parents and students that are like, oh, you're talking about the little ice age and this is all about your liberal climate change agenda. And then over the last few years, that kind of political rhetoric has started to slip into the classroom, which is unfortunate. My current position, I'm allowed a lot more freedom than in public schools, where in public schools, it was difficult because if I said anything that seemed like an opinion or that seemed to run contrary to sort of someone's worldview, that would be very uncomfortable for people. And a lot of folks, obviously, given how people like to consume media and the news, they really only want to hear what confirms their worldview and what affirms what they know about the world. And I love the opposite. Like, I love running headlong into the thing that is different and unknown. And that's where I think students should go too. And so sometimes that's very, very fraught, especially for young people as they're forging their own social and political identities. And for parents who feel very strongly that they have an understanding of what their child's social and political and identities are. And, I'm this third party coming in and saying, well, actually, everything's a construct, and, I'm just here to teach critical thinking and writing and reading skills.
Yeah, the conflict between like what the parents said, like I learned in school versus
exactly.
Like, the students.
Yeah, and that to me is very unfortunate, because I think most people view history as sort of like the History Channel, like ice road truckers. I'm just gonna read a story about dead white men. And that's not the case at all. So that's kind of a problem. But I like that problem. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of problem that I am like totally prepared to
and it's so much more important because you're like out there doing at least younger students who are like going to college and then hopefully find a passion for history themselves. But like, it's also just like it's not a lot of academics especially tend to teach just in the university, and that I wouldn't say like this is all true across the brand, and definitely not true of a lot of historians, but it tends to like limit their perspective and limit like where they're coming from.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I really enjoy about the AHA and the organization that I'm also involved with, the World History Association, that they're very open to secondary teachers coming in and learning from people at higher ed levels, because my students at my current school are looking to go to very high-level universities, and I want to make sure that the work that I'm giving them in high school is valuable and relevant to what they're going to be expected to do, even if they don't perhaps go into history. Maybe there's a sociologist in one of my classes, who knows? But I do believe that the skills that I can give them as a historian are invaluable, and I want to make sure that I'm in step with academia.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about the World History Association and why you find AHA as well?
Oh my gosh! So the World History Association is the like the American Historical Association, is the annual meeting and I guess sort of companion publication for anyone who teaches and writes about world history. And it's very unique because the way that the organization was created was that they knew that world history was something that was going to be taught at the secondary level as well as at the higher ed level. And so there's a lot of conversation between those two. Like, I'm going to go do all of this scholarly research as like a professor, and I want to pair with someone who works in secondary education. That's how I actually ended up on this panel that I'm going to speak at about teaching the American Revolution. And I've been very lucky enough.
I know somebody going to this.
Yeah. And I've been fortunate enough to teach the American Revolution through like a world history lens, but then also for the last few years teach it in a solely American perspective. And, and I've been able to go through and see how students do in both environments and sort of the pluses and values, and then take that to people in higher ed and sort of talk about what those results are like.
Yeah, and then speaking of, I guess, public history and being a public historian, I understand that you're looking to start a podcast, so you have one starting.
Yeah. I've started a podcast.
What's it about?
It's called Crying Boomers, and it's about modern art history from, I don't know, like World War II, maybe the 19th century, and I don't know, we're going to do whatever we want. But it's really about modern art, because my co-host, Herbert, is an artist, and there was this amazing Andy Warhol exhibition in Atlanta, and I don't know anything about Andy Warhol, but he was a part of the standards that I had to teach for my U.S. history course. And what I've learned over the years of being a historian is just ask an expert, and she was an expert. So I bought us tickets to Andy Warhol, and we walked around the whole museum.
Oh, that's amazing.
And we had such a good time because she knew all about the art, and I knew about the history, and she was homeschooled, so she like knows art history. I know history, and we had a blast. And at one point, she was telling me that like modern art in a lot of ways, especially after World War II, is basically like drunk baby boomers throwing empty beer bottles at each other in like Hell's Kitchen in the 60s, which is hilarious because the baby boomers were being born in the 60s, which makes that horrifyingly inaccurate.
Yeah.
And I don't know, but it's going to be a very fun, probably foul-mouthed look at sort of what makes something art, what makes it meaningful, and like you do with the history of porn, we definitely have had the conversation of like, is this pornography, is this art? And we can look at something and go, actually, this is art, and it's so funny.
I'm so excited to see like where this goes.
Yeah.
How about you tell us like where we can find it and like where we can find you as well?
So you can find me on Twitter. My username is @AMY, and then my last name, Man Lapis. That's MANLAPAS, or @Crying Boomers. I haven't tweeted anything yet, so just go onto my Twitter account and find me. I'll keep you guys updated, and you can put in requests for episodes or whatever. I just want to talk with people about history and answer their questions. And,
Great. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem.
So let's start with like telling us about who you are, like what you're researching, where you are right now.
Sure. So I'm Jason Herbert. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Minnesota. I focus on indigenous Florida. My dissertation is actually called Beast of Many Names, Cattle, Conflict, and the Transformation of Indigenous Florida, 1513 to 1858. And what I'm looking at specifically is the transformation of Florida via the introduction of livestock husbandry, specifically cattle, over the course of roughly 3 centuries. And Florida is really kind of this interesting place because, it's prone, many people will know that it's really prone to being overrun by invasive species. In Florida, we've got pythons, we've got lionfish, we've got iguanas, we've got people from Jersey.
The most dangerous of all.
Exactly. And very much I treat cattle like an invasive species, as this exotic species, but the reason why we kind of come to accept all of these animals, Jerseyans included, as natural to Florida is because they've been so long and they've really kind of filled a niche in the state. And what I'm looking at is really how Florida Indians reacted to this creature of empire and how they came to use this animal for their own good and ultimately made this animal their own. So that's the basic idea.
Do you focus on specific tribes, the Seminoles? Am I remembering that right?
Ultimately, it becomes a Seminole and Miccosukee story because those are the tribes that currently live in Florida. But it really starts off in the 1500s when there's no such thing as a Seminole in Florida. Seminoles really kind of come to be properly termed in the 1900s. So the people that are in Florida at that time are Arcalusas and their Appalachians and their Timucuas and Tequestas and Ais, and various other tribes. There's more than just those. So I'm really careful when I use the words to say Florida Indians or maybe Native Floridians and things like that. But ultimately, it does become a Seminole story, because the thing that people don't really understand about Florida and cattle and maybe even Florida Indians is that the Seminole tribe currently possesses about 12,000 head of beef on their reservations.
Wow.
They are the 12th largest beef producing entity in the United States.
Holy crap.
And when you talk to Seminole cowmen and cattle women on the reservation today, they take a lot of pride in that. I was just on the reservation recently speaking to Alex Johns, who is the first Seminole head of the Florida Cattlemen's Association, and he'll tell you very specifically, as he told me, he's like, we have always been cow people. The cow is the most important animal in our own history, and a lot of people don't understand that. And one of the things I really kind of get around to hopefully showing people, because when we talk about indigenous Florida, we talk about the history of agriculture or husbandry in Florida or in the greater Southeast, Native American contributions get overlooked, even in our own high school textbooks, which really kind of go directly from Spanish introduction to cattle to these American cracker farmers and cowmen in the 1800s. But the reality is, absolutely. But the reality is that it was always Native peoples working these animals. As Alex told me the other day, the first cowboys in North America were Indians, Florida Indians. So I'm trying to really unite this story of modern Seminole cattle production with Florida Indian cattle production, because what happens is during the Second, Third, and Seminole Wars, or as the Seminoles call the White War, Mr. Johns told me recently, he's like, we just consider it one war because we never knew when the Americans were going to attack again. But after that war, Seminoles aren't really allowed to own cattle. Cattle ownership is taboo, and so the animals are kind of outside of the Seminole periphery for about 85 years. And then they're reintroduced to it during the New Deal. So what I'm trying to do now is trying to link these two histories, and hopefully, in addition to telling a larger story of indigeneity and survival and perseverance, also hopefully give back to the tribe in some small way, if I can, a piece of their history to say, this is what Florida Indians did, and this is how animals were used in Florida, not only by Seminoles, but really in the time period by Calusas and Timucuas and Appalachians, and then later into the 1800s, smaller communities like the Alachuas, the Tallahassees, the Swanees, and so forth.
So, like, in a sense, what you're saying is, like, it's not cowboys and Indians. It's in fact the Indians were the cowboys all along.
Well, exactly. You know, one of the things that I kind of float around for when this eventually will become a book is really calling it this project Cowboys and Indians, because they were, in fact, both. And that's the thing that I'm really trying to link, is the idea that there were tens of thousands of these animals in Florida, and they were being shepherded by Florida Indians. They were a very real part of their livelihoods, and Florida Indians really made Florida what it is today. And then there's also the larger aspect that I'm trying to tie things to, because when we talk about American processes of manifest destiny, we easily cast a gaze beyond the Mississippi River, and we start talking about the Plains Indian Wars and things like that, and perhaps rightfully so. Those were very real processes, but those processes happen after what happens in Florida, and you can also say Missouri or maybe even Ohio or things like that. But what happened in Florida was very particular and unique. And what I'm saying is that all this time we've been looking west to the Mississippi River. We should have been looking east of the Apalachicola. All of these processes happened in Florida first, well before this time period. And in a lot of ways, Florida, when we consider the experience of American Indians and cattle, Florida really becomes the first West in a lot of different ways, and that's something that a couple scholars have kind of keyed in on.
I was gonna. My observation was kind of like it's really interesting. It's from what you're saying is Florida is almost this test case for both
very much so.
Imperialism and probably racist policies, but also survival.
Oh, absolutely. One of the interesting things, and essentially what I'm trying to do is use cattle almost as a lens to look at the transformation of. Absolutely, right? When I was talking to Mr. Johns the other day, he says, when the Spanish arrived, we still had bison in Florida. Now, bison were on their way out. There weren't many, but he's like, in a lot of ways, these cattle came and it was like the bison had come back to us when these cattle had kind of taken their place. It was like they had been reinvigorated and come back to us. But say, skipping forward into, say, the 1800s, when you're looking specifically at, say, the Second and Third Seminole Wars, respectively, 1835 to 1842, 1855 to 1858, a lot of the American policies that you would see later play out on the plains against Native communities on the plains happened in Florida first. In fact, many of the same guys. There was a young lieutenant stationed in Fort Lauderdale. What was his name? William Sherman, right? So you've got this young lieutenant who's seeing these processes play out, and in fact, seeing that American policies of trying to of total war against the Seminoles, trying to take away cattle as well as their other animals, later get played out on the plains with bison in that very same way. So there are a lot of different policies that the United States plays out in Florida and later on tries to use against American Indians elsewhere. But really the key here for American Indians in Florida, or one of the keys, is their possession and mastery of cattle. By 1812, 1813, there were tens of thousands of cattle in Florida that are being shepherded by these Seminoles, and they're being traded. These products are being traded to the Spanish in Cuba, the British in the Bahamas, black market American traders. The Seminoles, or the people who will later become the Seminoles, are establishing themselves by 1812 as an Atlantic community. And that's the thing about Florida. Florida exists in two different places all at once. It is southeastern North America, but it is also the greater Caribbean. And the people in Florida who control that island, who are Native Americans, have this unique ability to relate to all these Atlantic communities. And there's this other aspect I like to point out, which is that we often, when we talk about Florida, we either say Spanish Florida or Florida in relation to America. But the reality is that when we say Spanish Florida, we imply that Spain controlled Florida. And the reality is that Spain never dominated Florida. Maybe for a short time with their mission system, they exuded some dominance in the 1600s, but that doesn't last long. By 1704, that's gone. And what Spanish are in Florida, really, the Spanish are really kind of prisoners of St. Augustine and Pensacola, and it's not Spanish Florida. It is Native Florida. It's Native American peoples who controlled that. And this presented a very viable threat to the United States, which is why the United States waged war, in part, against Native communities in Florida. So when we start to look at what Native peoples did with cattle, as just an example, right, we can see how powerful Native peoples were, how their ingenuity in dealing with other empires that are all trying to control them, yet this very small group in Florida is really exerting a heck of a lot of power for themselves. And later on, after the New Deal, we see that the same animal, cattle, and which will serve as an epilogue, comes again to the aid of Seminoles, when the Seminoles are, during the Age of Termination, literally selling off cattle, driving to Washington, D.C. in their cattle trucks, using this money to help fund their legal battles against termination. And we see that, again, this animal is key to Seminole survival, resistance, endurance, and ultimately mastery, because the Seminoles themselves have Seminole communities in Florida are incredibly vibrant. It's an incredibly wonderful place to go and visit. For me, I live a short time away, and much of it is because of those animals that are ranging on reservation lands to this day. So that's kind of the story of, or a short idea as far as what I'm looking at least initially. I'm still in the research phase of this dissertation, but I'm hoping to have it completed. Well, I guess now that we're in January next year. So. That's the idea behind the work.
So for people who are interested and want to learn more, like where should they go? Like try to find you?
The very first place I think that you should always go is not to read some blowhard like me, right? Is to go to the reservation.
Yeah.
Go to the tribal archives. Go to tribal websites and hear what Seminoles have to say about themselves. Read what Miccosukees have to say themselves. If you live in Minnesota and you're going up there and you want to know more about the Native peoples themselves, go to the Ojibwe websites. Go, if you are in Oklahoma, go to the Cherokee websites. Go directly to the people. And it's been expressed to me many times by members of the tribe in Florida. It's like, please, don't feel as though because you're not Native, you're not welcome here, because you very much are. I've been invited, my children have gone to Seminole rodeos And that's the very first place, is to go and listen to what Native peoples have to say for themselves.
Yeah.
And I hope that my research helps to reflect that, because I want it very much to be based in Native experiences and in Seminole and Miccosukee voices, and make sure that I'm privileging what they have to say for themselves, because it's ultimately their history. So the first place you should always go straight to the source. It's there for everybody. And hopefully for maybe even younger students, if you're a K through 12 educator or something like that, it's a great way to remind students that Native Americans are still here, they're present, they're vibrant, and welcome to students who want to learn about Native American history. That'd be the first place I would go.
Mm-hmm. And were you like you or your research?
For my research, you can find me tweeting away. It's the first place to find me. I'm at Herbert History on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the creator of something called Historians at the Movies, which shows some films every Sunday night, and then we tweet away at that every Sunday night at 8 Eastern. You can find me that, or you can find me at the University of Minnesota webpage. You just look there for Jason Herbert. And that's the quick and easy story of me.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. I can't wait to hear more from you.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.